The plan for Overlord had been that Ike was to be the supreme commander, but Ike was required to use Monty as his deputy, and the agreement was that Monty had overall command of all ground armies in Normandy until such time that the American presence was large enough to give separate command to an American over the American armies. And instead of that being left to an arbitrary judgment, the deadline had been determined to be the 1st of September, which Monty had agreed to because he assumed that it would be easy to kill Hitler and wrap up the war by making terms with the Anglophile Remainers in the General German Staff within 90 days. Until the 1st of September, Monty was to decide the boundaries between the American and the British sectors, and Monty was also in charge of doling out supplies as well as picking all aerial bombing targets, and Monty personally directed the secret SAS, who were blowing up trains and carefully selected railroads, and Monty's chosen date to have accomplished his separate peace with the Germans had been the 1st of August, not simply to keep Patton out of the Normandy theater as payback for the march to Messina, but because it also just so happened to be the same date that the Great War had kicked off 30 years earlier. When it neared time to transfer control of American troops over to an American commander as agreed to in Overlord, the British newspapers began reporting outrage that the Americans were threatening to steal command away from their beloved Monty. The stunning American victory on the 30th of July at Avranches, while headed for Brest, had been won with the help of the same French locals who would save Paris from being destroyed through their negotiations with von Schultz. And many of the French communists who would fire at Germans during the handover in Paris were actually the same British SAS who'd been working with the communists in Yugoslavia. When the French, working with Patton, convinced von Schultz not to burn down Paris, Hitler cut off food to the city. But the Parisians went out to the countryside on bicycles and brought back food to their countrymen, and Monty insisted that Paris was starving, while the Americans knew that Paris could hold out until after Hitler was defeated. When Patton closed the Falay's pocket on the 21st of August, he'd gone over into Monty's territory and ran into many German squads moving freely around the British sector and took them all prisoner, and to make matters worse, as the deadline for the British to hand over command of the American troops drew near, the incredible destruction of the French countryside in aerial bombing had failed to turn the population of France against the Americans. By the end of August, the American armies had suffered 125,000 casualties since D-Day, with 21,000 of them killed. And on the day of the power switch, Bradley started calling his headquarters Eagle, and when Monty heard this, he started calling his headquarters Lion. Hitler was very unhappy that Monty's schemes to stop the Americans had failed, while too many German men and materials were being spent in Normandy that was desperately needed to fight the Russians in the east. Hitler was more than ready for the peace plan to go through that would get the British to get the Americans to help the Germans stop the Russians. And Hitler was furious with Monty that all his plans had failed, so now Market Garden simply had to work to bring America to its knees and force the world to recognize a justifiable negotiated peace between Britain and Germany, and Monty was insisting that it could be accomplished by Christmas. The Germans were furious that the international Jews had caused and were continuing to drive Hitler's war, so the Germans put extra pillars in their basements and dug tunnels between their houses in case their homes were bombed. And if Britain made a separate peace with Germany, then America would not be paid back for its Lend-Lease loans to England. So America had built up Russia so the Russians could defeat Germany. But Russia hadn't been getting the job done, so FDR sent the Americans over to finish the job, first to North Africa, and then to Italy, and then to France. Because if the Russians made a separate peace with Germany, it would be very likely that the British would have had to quickly capitulate, and that would have left the Americans high and dry. The British ordered the Americans to halt, because Monty was going to do Market Garden, and Monty claimed to need not only all the available gas and ammo to do it, but also all of the Americans, commanded by Hodges' 1st and Simpson's 9th Armies, and for lack of supplies to Patton, the 11th Panzer Division was able to retreat into the Vosges Mountains west of Strasbourg, to be joined by 90,000 other German soldiers from all around southern France, while 90 British SAS parachuted into the Vosges Mountains for Operation Leuthen, and 1/3 of these SAS would be executed as soon as Market Garden failed. The Americans had surrounded Aachen when they began starving for supplies in September, as priority was given to Market Garden. And Aachen had been Charlemagne's capital, and Charlemagne had been the founder of the First German Reich. Aachen was where 31 Holy Roman Emperors had been crowned until the godless Napoleon marched through Europe and put an end to the Holy Roman Empire, and Hitler was intent on bringing it back. Russia and Prussia had made peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Tilsit, and Napoleon's France had pledged to help Russia against Ottoman Turkey in exchange for Russia joining the continental system against the British Empire. And the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 had been the result of the Battle of Friedland in Königsberg, and Königsberg was the ancient sacred capital of Prussia from way back in the days of the Teutonic Knights. The Battle of the Courland Pocket in 1944 would result from the Germans trying to save this nucleus of the fatherland at Königsberg, and when the Russians had made peace with Napoleon at Königsberg, the British swore to never forgive them because it had taken another 7 years to finally defeat Napoleon without Russia's help. Aachen was only 20 miles away from Liège, where the Americans were busy building the largest supply dump of Hitler's war, and the Treaty of Aachen, signed in 1668, had been the result of fighting between France and the Austrian Habsburg Spanish Netherlands that had belonged to the Holy Roman Empire from 1556 to 1714, and its capital had been at Brussels. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in Holland in 1713, was the result of a separate peace negotiated after the British abandoned their Dutch allies on the battlefield, leaving them at the mercy of the other swindled ally, Austria. England was now riven in twain upon the issue of peace. A separate peace it must be now, for the Allies one and all repudiated the right of the British government to abandon the alliance and provide for themselves. In that haughty, fierce society of London and of Europe no agreement was possible. Upon a dark day the British army, hitherto the most forward in the Allied cause and admired by all, marched away from the camp of the Allies in bitter humiliation and amid the curses of their old comrades. Only a handful of the British paid allies would go with them, although deprived of their pay and arrears. The great majority declared that they would fight on for the common cause, quote-unquote common cause. Many of Marlborough's veterans flung themselves on the ground in shame and fury. The outraged Dutch closed the gates of their cities in the face of the deserting ally. Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, arranged by Henry Steele Commager, New York Pocketbook, Simon & Schuster, 1966, page 93 and 4. As soon as the British House of Hanover was brought into being, their Queen Anne's War went on for 11 years and ended with Britain taking Canada away from the French and taking Gibraltar away from the Spanish. And the House of Hanover's first wars, ending with the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, was signed 30 miles away from Arnhem, where Monty was now headed for his Operation Market Garden. Switching sides in the middle of a war was a time-tested tactic for the British, and the John Churchill of Marlborough, who had won Queen Anne's War, had been made the first Duke of Marlborough for his great military victory that brought about the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, and the first Duke of Marlborough's father had been named Winston Churchill, And the Winston Churchill who was wanting to make a separate peace with Germany in 1944 was a direct descendant of these Marlborough Churchills and had written a book about his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough Churchill, that was 4 volumes long, a history that Churchill had started writing in 1933 and had completed in 1938. The first Duke of Marlborough Churchill had fought for the Catholic English James II, and then switched sides to fight against him to help the Dutch Orange William invade England, but secretly had tried to get James II back in power, and when Orange William found out about this double-dealing and betrayal, he fired Marlborough Churchill, not for the side-switching, but for misusing public money. The House of Hanover pardoned Marlborough Churchill first thing, and Churchill in 1933 had taken pains to make Marlborough an heroic figure and had credited him with the very creation and founding of the House of Hanover. On September 16, 1701, James II died. The maritime powers had scarcely a friendly port beyond their coasts. The New World, except in the north, was barred against them. The Mediterranean had become in effect a French lake. South of Plymouth no fortified harbour lay open to British and Dutch ships. They had their superior fleets, but no bases which would carry them to the inland sea. William died at 52, worn out by his labours. Marlborough, at the same age, strode forward against tremendous odds upon the 10 years of unbroken victory, which raised the British nation to a height in the world it had never before attained. The age of Anne is rightly regarded as the greatest manifestation of the power of England, when in March 1702, Anne ascended the throne. She accepted Marlborough's impulse upon the whole policy of the state. In the first momentous days of her reign, he was not only her chief, but her sole guide. Both main parties admired him. In a blaze of loyalty, it was the sunshine day for which Princess Anne had long waited, but all fell into Marlborough's hands. Churchill's History, page 34 and 41. 241. By 1740, the House of Hanover had entrenched itself in Silesia, and the British told Maria Theresa that they would give her beloved Silesia back to her, but they gave it to her enemy Prussia instead, when Britain won the War of the Austrian Succession, even though they'd been allied with Maria Theresa. The House of Hanover's George II had just beaten Frederick II the Great, who would come back 8 years later for round 2, and there'd been an elaborate ceremony at Aachen in 1748 to sign the treaty making Silesia a Prussian territory that would help Frederick II the Great to prosper into a great power, even though he'd just been beaten by the British House of Hanover. Frederick II the Great came back for his round 2 in 1756, and the war over Silesia reappeared as the 7 Years' War, or Third Silesian, but this time it would be Prussia and George II of Britain against everyone else, and the House of Hanover's George II claimed to have started the 7 Years' War to protect his ancestral homeland of Hanover, which was the north coast of Germany between Holland and Hamburg, all the way down to Nordhausen, just east of the Ruhr. The first Treaty of Aachen had been in the year 803 between Charlemagne and the Byzantine Emperor from Constantinople that decided the border between the Franks and the Turks at the lovely port of Trieste. And Charlemagne had won Trieste away from what was left of Rome. When Charlemagne died at the age of 72, he was buried in the cathedral he'd built at Aachen, and Frederick I, who was called Barbarossa, canonized Charlemagne several hundred years later and opened his tomb and reburied Charlemagne under the floor of the cathedral, and Frederick II the Great dug Charlemagne up again and put him in a coffin made of silver and gold. When the British allied with Austria for Maria Theresa's war in 1740, They used the same battlefields that would host the sequel 8 years later in the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. But this time, Britain had switched sides to fight alongside Frederick II the Great, who was at war with Austria. And the British had learned in 1748 where all the Austrian supply dumps and troops were stationed. When the 7 Years' War ended, all the other countries except Britain were exhausted from having been at war for 62 years ever since the founding of the House of Hanover. And that left Britain in 1763 the uncontested ruler of the seas and the foremost colonial power. Maria Theresa spoke German, and her husband had come from Lorraine, where Metz was, and Metz was where Patton was marching forward against written orders. And the 1740 War of the Austrian Succession had lost Maria Theresa's ancestral lands of Silesia, even though she'd won the war. And Maria Theresa had come out the loser for having allied herself with the British. Now, instead of Britain and Austria fighting Spain, France, and Prussia, the 1756 7 Years' War would be Britain and Prussia fighting Spain, France, and Austria. And it would go on for 7 years while the British used their insider knowledge of Austrian military positions to cripple Austria's allies, France and Spain, two countries who had made themselves at home in America. The British Prime Minister imposed the Stamp Act on the American colonies in 1765 to pay for the 7 Years' War. And most of the American Indians sided with the French in America against the British, which is why the 7 Years' War was also called the French and Indian Wars. And the Americans did not agree that beating the French in Canada had anything to do with Americans, who got along fine with their French friends. The Stamp Act failed, and 2 years later the Crown tried the Revenue Act that taxed tea and 5 other items brought over on English ships. And when the Americans quit buying these English goods, the tax was lightened to only tea in 1770. And 3 years later, the Americans painted themselves like Indians and invited themselves aboard some English ships to dump tea into the Boston harbor. The British had sent over a huge supply of tea to sell cheaply at a loss, hoping to put the American beverage companies out of business. And when the underpriced tea went into the drink, the Crown responded by taking away the Americans' charter. The Americans congressed and wrote a Declaration of Rights demanding that the Crown restore their rights as good English colonists, but the Crown refused, and the Don't Tread on Me and the Liberty flag were unfurled, and the War of American Independence got underway. The British Parliament considered a reconciliation bill in 1778 to grant restoration of the rights of the Americans, but because the French had jumped in on the side of the colonists in America as payback for the 7 Years' War, and because the Americans had welcomed the French as friends, the British decided that they hated Americans as much as they hated the French. And then Spain joined in with France, so Britain was alone against all of Europe, but they had only themselves to blame. The British surrendered to the Americans at Yorktown and were made to sign the Treaty of Versailles in 1783, where Florida was given to Spain as a thank you, and the French would stage a revolution of their own against the nobility and its unbearable taxes in 1789. And when France was recovering from the Napoleonic Wars that naturally followed their attempt to overturn the rule of nobility in France, the American South found out that Britain would not help them simply in order to buy cotton, but because they hoped that by splitting up the American states, the Crown could maintain its place as the most powerful country in the world, and from there be able to fulfill their dream of making the King of England also the King of France. Thomas Jefferson thought that government should be in the business of protecting people's rights, and that the pursuit of happiness was the most important, because that is what life, liberty, and property were for. And the Americans wrote the Declaration of Independence from ideas they'd gotten from Frenchmen like Rousseau, and the French helped Washington win the war by smuggling in supplies. The French had been too busy fighting with the British in 1763 in America and India to be able to be of much help to Maria Theresa in the 7 Years' War. And during that war, George Washington had been an officer in the British Army in America. The French finally lost, and French Canada was given to Britain, and Britain got rid of the French in India and in the West Indies, and the British had become the ruler of the seas after the 7 Years' War because they'd been helping the Muslims fight Russians in the Black Sea, keeping Russia from being able to help her friend France. The Russians had been fighting Muslims for a very long time, ever since the scourge of Islam invaded Constantinople. And in Moldavia in 1770, an army of 40,000 Russians fought 75,000 Muslims, many of whom were Janissary children stolen from their European parents and forced to become Muslims. And then the children were made to fight for the Islamic Ottomans. 3/5 of the Muslims in Moldavia were on horseback, but were defeated by the smaller Russian army, and the Russians lost only 1,000 men, while the Muslims lost 20,000 killed or wounded, and 1/3 of the Ottoman Muslims had been drowned in the Danube trying to escape. Prussia and Britain had both stepped in to help the Muslims during the 7 Years' War, and Catherine the Great had been forced to give up half of Poland, but was allowed to keep her important ports in the Crimea on the Black Sea, and she had freed from Muslim occupation, and Catherine the Great had won back the entire Crimea the same month that Britain was blockading Boston Harbor to punish the Americans for the Boston Tea Party. The Crown was demanding that the Americans pay damages to the British East India Company for the loss of their tea, and the other American colonies started sending supplies overland to Boston to defeat the British blockade, and providing this relief to Boston unified the American colonies, and that unity would allow them to win in the upcoming war against the British. Catherine the Great spent 6 months enjoying the Crimea with her friend, the Austrian Holy Roman Emperor, who was the eldest son of Maria Theresa and the brother of Marie Antoinette. And the following year, the Muslims attacked again, but were beaten back by the Russians with the help of the Austrians, and the Russian border with the Muslims was pushed back all the way to the Dniester River, freeing the Ukrainians from the scourge of Islam. Catherine the Great named a port on the coast of the Black Sea Odessa, in honor of the Polish king of the Kievan Rus, who had inherited that port from the Greeks, and its Greek name had been Odessa before the Battle of Varna in 1444 during the Crusades that had lost the Ukraine to the Muslims, a crucial defeat that had set up the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans would murder all the Janissaries in 1826, prompting the Russians to return to take care of more business with the Islamists, and Russia would try again to save the Christians in Constantinople in 1877, but the British sent the fleet to oppose them. When the British withdrew from Afghanistan 4 years later in 1881, because they were stretched too thin, having to defend their bases in Egypt and Cyprus and Malta and Gibraltar, the Kaiser sent the gunboat Panther in 1911 to Agadir in Morocco to help the French keep the British out of French Morocco in North Africa. And when Britain sued for peace 7 years later on the 11th of November in 1918, they claimed that the Crown didn't want to ruin Germany, so that reparations might be exacted in order to pay America for having saved the Crown from suffering the same fate as Austria, Russia, Germany, Italy, and France, who were no longer being guided by the superior wisdom and experience of nobility. Meanwhile, in the New World, America didn't have schools for all the people living on farms, and when the government had tried to build schools for everyone, the kids on farms had been left out, and so they'd grown up exceptionally independent, and the Depression further taught them to do much with little. Most of America's farm kids had been used to having shoes only to wear during the winter, and so the provisions given them by Uncle Sam to fight Hitler were certainly a godsend, and they were sent over to Europe better equipped than any other soldier in the world, unbeatably outfitted with everything they would need to stop the super soldiers of the German army. While the food might have been better back home, the young men fresh off America's farms appreciated the clothing and equipment given them for fighting in Hitler's war, and from their experience fixing the recalcitrant farm equipment of the 30s, they had what it took to make that army equipment work. Aachen in Germany was a mere 35 miles away from the holy city of Cologne on the Rhine, and in September of 1944, Monty was planning for the Americans to march to the city of Aachen and allowed them exactly enough gasoline and ammo to get there, but no further. And the only secure road from Cologne to Aachen went through Schmidt, and the town of Schmidt was named after the family who had once lived in the county, so Hitler was certain that General Schmidt would defend it as though it were his own home, since it was. The county of Brandenburg was being defended by General Brandenburger, and the Hürtgen forest was on the southern edge of Aachen and completely protected the city, while the Ardennes forest was 40 miles farther south, and the Germans had an advantage in the Hürtgen forest because a large portion of German equipment was still being drawn by horses. The Germans were busy on the other side of the forest, stockpiling reinforcements, quote, as far as the eye can see, close quote, to drive the Americans out of Europe and back into the ocean, while Monty would be up in Arnhem at the bridge too far, unable to come to the assistance of the Americans, being overrun 100 miles to the south in the upcoming Battle of the Bulge, and that would leave the British justifiably forced to come to Aachen to make peace with the Germans, just as Napoleon had been forced to surrender in the exact same scenario when one of his French generals had sided with the Prussians, refusing to come to Napoleon's aid during the Battle of Waterloo, which had not been seen as betrayal by that officer, but done with the best intentions of putting an overdue end to the war.